Okay, great. Great. All right. Hello. Welcome to today's meeting of the Finance Committee of Council on Post-Secondary Education. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this meeting is being live streamed to YouTube, and all audio and video is being captured and recorded. Council members, in order to participate in today's meeting, please keep your video feed on, but leave your microphone muted unless you need to speak. Unless anybody has any questions, Heather, please call the roll.
Sure. Chair Ben Brandsetter.
Here.
Vice Chair Hellbauer. Mr. Grant Minix.
Here.
Mr. Richard Nelson. I see him. Dr. Robert Sapp.
Sorry, Heather. Here.
I'm here. Gotcha. Ms. Carol Wright.
Here.
Okay. Ms. Cheryl Zimmerman. Here. And then I saw Ms. Vice Chair Hallbauer has joined.
Here.
All right. Everyone's here.
Great. The meeting minutes from the April 20th, 2020 meeting are in your materials. Are there any objections or comments to those as they are presented?
Yes, I was there. I don't show up in the minutes, but well, I show up later on in the minutes, but not in attendance. I was there.
No.
Okay, I'll get that change made.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Statt. Any other comments? If not, we'll note them as approved as amended with Dr. Statt's addition. We do have a handful of action items in our meeting today. I did want to let everybody know that President Thompson is currently attending the SREB Higher Education Recovery Task Force meeting. So he will not be joining us right now, although I do think I saw his name.
Yeah, he did pop in.
Oh, he did.
Chair Brandstetter, I decided to jump in for a few minutes before jumping on that other. So yes.
Okay, fantastic. All right, thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Let's see, Bill, I think that takes us into section 3 of our agenda today, 2020 and 2021 campus tuition and mandatory fee proposals. And these are action items. From a process standpoint, I assume we'll do all these together as one motion for all 6 proposals together. And if for council members, if you guys have any questions, please remember to unmute your device. So Bill, go ahead. Looks like we've got Kentucky State to start out with.
Okay, and before I get started, Chair Brandstetter, first of all, welcome committee members. Good afternoon. President Thompson, would you like to say any comments before I get started?
Thanks, Will. Only just to say that we have had a chance to talk with Budget Director John Hicks, and in fact, things are looking dire for this year. We will be moving at least toward the 1% cut. They are still predicting what the cuts will make, well, what the budget will look like in fiscal year 21, excuse me, 2021. It doesn't look great. His hope is that the federal government would allow the governor to have some discretion over the dollars that the feds have sent to him to try to offset some of the budget deficit, and that if there's a second or fourth CARES, I should say, that some will be directed toward the ability to allow the governor to address state budget shortfalls. Obviously, that's important to us at 2 levels. One is that it would create an opportunity for the state to fill the necessary holes that it needs to fill in order to keep the economy going. And number 2, it would probably mitigate the cuts that would come to the council and to our higher ed institutions. So our hope is that we'll see some relief, but we don't know how close that is or if that will be. but the conversation that we're having with our campuses, they are obviously taking every effort they have to make sure that they do the cuts while preparing for them. So thus, what does the fall look like? Well, talking to my colleague presidents, in some cases holding steady, some cases it's short, especially the first year students. We have many of our students that haven't taken the FAFSA that we're pushing to take the FAFSA. And so the business model is we don't know how it's going to look. I was interviewed by Fox Business Weekly about what will the business model look like for higher ed after COVID-19. And obviously I informed them what you could imagine I would, that it depends on a lot of things. First of all, whether or not we're able to fully be a functioning campus as we were in January. Well, bottom line, we won't be. So we know that there will be some significant deficits on our campuses, no matter even if we're back face-to-face in the fall, which we are planning. So just to give the Finance Committee a heads up, I appreciate the campuses, even with that knowledge coming in, all those that are coming in with a no or very low tuition ask. So Bill, that's all I have to offer unless there's questions that is needed of me.
All right, thank you, President Thompson. And Chair Branstetter, President Thompson, before I weigh in on the campus tuition and fee proposals for your review and approval, I would like you to welcome a new staff person we have in the Finance and Budget Unit here at the Council. His name is Ryan Kaffenberger. If some of you may have been around long enough to remember a guy by the name of Scott Belcher, who left the Council about 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm sure all of you know Sharon Jackson. Well, Scott left, as I said, 3 or 4 years ago, and we made the decision not to replace him for 2 or 3 years, because every year we received another budget cut. And we were trying to wait for better times before we replace Scott. Well, now Sharon Jackson retired at the end of May, but we're very happy in mid-May to have Ryan Kaffenberger join us here at the Council. And just to tell you a little bit about Ryan, he got his Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Kentucky in Business and Economics. He graduated summa cum laude. He got his master's degree in public administration from the Martin School at the University of Kentucky. In the year that he graduated, he not only had a 4.0 GPA, but he was awarded the best Master of Public Administration student that graduated that year. He also received a graduate certificate in public financial management from the Martin School at the University of Kentucky while he was working on his master's degree. Ryan comes to us from Commerce Lexington Economic Development Department, where he was the research director. And Ryan, I don't know, are you calling in? Are you on the line?
Yep, I'm here, Bill.
Yeah, would you like to just say hello to the group? And I'm glad you spoke up because now we can see you. But just say hello to the members of the Finance Committee. And is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, honestly, thank you for just letting me be a part of this, and I'm excited to be a part of this team. I know I come from the world of economic development, and from the beginning, even in the interview process, I see working at CPE as not a very big departure, because workforce is what drives economic development. And so I'm excited to do that and apply a lot of the skills I got while getting my master's degree.
All right, thank you, Ryan. And I will let you know, Finance Committee members, Ryan hit the ground running. Each of the 6 agenda items that you have in your packet, Ryan put those together for us. And so we really appreciate the heavy lifting that he did in drafting and reviewing and working with each of the CBOs at each of those campuses to make sure that the information that we present to you today is accurate. So let's go ahead and get started then in terms of the campus tuition.
Bill, can I add just, well, first of all, it's good to see Ryan, but you mentioned Sharon. Are we going to have a chance to get together at some point to honor him in his retirement?
Sean and I are planning to draft a resolution that hopefully we can bring to the council next week and have the council adopt that resolution. And I'm going to try to make arrangements for Sharon to be at that council meeting. And so that might be the last opportunity that a lot of us have to see Sharon before he goes ahead and fully retires. As you know, he retired 5 or 6 years ago after he got 33 or 34 years of service in, and he's come back to the council. He had about a 1 year a sabbatical, if you will, and then he came back to the council part-time, and he's been here for about another 5 years at least. So he's got 41 years in with the state of Kentucky. So we are planning to bring a resolution to the council for your review and adoption. And hopefully he'll be able to join us at the business meeting next week so all of us can say goodbye to Sharon. And it's my understanding that him and Daphne are going to be looking to relocate to maybe Ridgeland or Madison, Mississippi, which is where a lot of my family lives, my parents and my aunt and uncle and my sister and her family. So I hope to be able, at least every Thanksgiving and every Christmas when I travel south to visit family, I hope to be able to get together with Sharon in the years to come.
Very good. Thank you.
So any other comments before we jump into tuition and fee setting? Okay, as I said, you've got 5 agenda items in your packet. 5 of the agenda items are from comprehensive universities. Every comprehensive university is represented other than EKU, Eastern Kentucky University. And then we also have an agenda item for KCTCS. So those 6 agenda items are the ones that we're going to be presenting to you today. And just to remind members of the Finance Committee of the actions that were taken by the council on April 24th. The council voted to establish no tuition parameters for resident undergraduate tuition and fees for the upcoming academic year. And as you know, the reasoning behind that action was in response to the disruption and economic uncertainty surrounding COVID-19. The council also voted to allow institutions to charge market competitive rates for graduate and online courses. So obviously, as a result of these actions, the institutions have been given fairly broad discretion to determine their own tuition and fee increases for academic year 2021. So what are the 6 institutions proposing that we're bringing to you today? Go to the next slide, Heather. I think you'll be very pleased to see that in terms of base rate increases, 5 of those 6 institutions are proposing no increase. So at KSU, Moorhead, Murray, Northern, and Western, the 5 comprehensive universities that submitted their tuition and fee proposals for your review today, they're all proposing no increase in resident undergraduate tuition and fees. KCTCS is proposing a $5 per credit hour increase in their resident tuition and fee charges. That would increase it from $174 per credit hour currently to $179 per credit hour next year. That's a 2.9% increase. And that was the level of increase that staff had proposed at one of our previous Finance Committee meetings. We had recommended a $5 per credit hour increase at KCTCS. I will point out footnote number 1 for Murray State University that base rate that they're proposing in 2020-21 does not include a $3 per credit hour increase in their asset preservation fee. As you may recall, the full council approved an asset preservation fee for Murray State University for the current academic year, but at the request of council staff, Murray State proposed to phase in that asset preservation fee, implementing a $7 fee per credit hour for the current year. And then for this upcoming 2021 academic year, it would increase to $10 per credit hour. So that's something that the council has already approved in terms of the phase-in of that asset preservation fee. And so there will be about a 1.3, 1.4% increase for Murray State University students associated with that increase in the asset preservation fee, but in terms of the actual increase in their tuition base rate, they're proposing no increase. So are there any questions about what the institutions are proposing? Okay, Heather, let's go to the next slide. And obviously, staff is recommending that the Finance Committee approve the resident undergraduate tuition and fees for the upcoming academic year as proposed by K-State, Moorhead, Murray, Northern, Western, and KCTCS. We are also recommending approval of their non-resident graduate and online rates as proposed. And there's a lot more detail, obviously, in the agenda items that Ryan Kaffenberger developed for us. And I'm sure that Finance Committee members have read through each of those agenda items. But at kind of a 10,000-foot level, every comprehensive university that's bringing their proposal before the Finance Committee today is recommending no increase in their base rate tuition. KCTCS is recommending a 2.9% increase.
Do you need a motion to approve this?
That's up to Chair Branstetter.
I got muted. Thank you, Bill. I was looking through the content on the onboard slides and everything. Is there anything else that you want to go through? That there's obviously a lot more content on here. Is there anything else that you want to touch on that's in our packet that's not in these slides right now?
Well, I would say that Finance Committee members might want to look at the estimated tuition and fee revenue, which is attachment B, and there's an attachment B for each one of these agenda items. And at most of these institutions, they're anticipating a lesser amount of gross billable tuition and fee revenue for the upcoming academic year than what they generated for the current year. And so at most of our institutions, this is actually going to end up being a decrease in revenue. And it probably, since you asked that question, probably would have been helpful for me to summarize that in a table. But at any rate, that would be some interesting information for council members to review. For example, at Kentucky State, they're estimating for the current year $13.1 million in gross billable tuition and fee revenue. Next year, given the 0% parameter that they're proposing, they're estimating a $10.3 million total gross billable tuition and fee revenue. At Moorhead State University, they're projecting a little over a $6 million decrease in their gross billable tuition and fee revenue. Murray State University looks like about $2.5 million of decreased revenue. Let's see, Northern, right at a $3 million reduction in their gross billable tuition and fee revenue. So you get a sense for what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And in most cases, institutions are anticipating, most of our institutions are anticipating a decrease in enrollment as well. And that's part of what's driving the reduction in gross billable tuition and fee revenue. And we actually collected that data from the institution, what were their enrollment projections for the upcoming fall, and then what would be the impact, at least just within that fall semester, in terms of the tuition and fee revenue. And so that's something that's not included in any of the information that we sent out today. We want to send that back out to the campuses one last time and get them to validate the data. But once that information has been verified, we will be sharing that with council members, so you get some sense of what to anticipate for this coming fall.
Thanks, Bill. And actually, that information is kind of the one that I was picking up on, and just help me a little bit, because I'm not, I don't remember seeing it in this form in our last iteration. I guess that was 2 years ago. But can you give us a sense of scale on, I guess, how accurate the estimates have been in the past? Now, granted, 2020, 21 is probably a crapshoot, and it's obviously everybody's doing as good as they can do to estimate it. But if we had gone back a year from now, looking at, I'm on Northern Sheet right now, and it's got a column for estimated 2019, 2020, and then with a number of $169 million. How close would that have, I guess, kind of, would the actual have been to that projection for this current year? Does that make sense?
Yes, the estimates usually are fairly accurate. There's not a
Okay.
large margin of error, and obviously, as they're making the estimates for the current year, for 1920, and when they made the estimate for the current year revenue last year, because they've already had a fall semester and they're midway through the spring semester, the current year estimates are usually more accurate than the estimates for the upcoming year.
Sure.
Because they're having to factor in, enrollment growth assumptions or enrollment decline assumptions, in addition to taking into account the new tuition and fee rates. But they have been running fairly accurate.
Okay. No, the manner which is presented in this is good. It kind of got me thinking about going back in a couple of years and actualizing that information.
Yeah, and it would be very easy for us to put together an analysis if you would like to see that. How close have the estimates been tracking to the actual tuition and fee revenue?
I'm not going to make that. You've got enough going on your plate right now, Bill. But you are nice to put forth that as an opportunity. So,
can I ask?
Brian Kaffenberger is chomping at the bit to jump all over that, Chair Brandstetter.
Actually,
Dr.
Bill,
Stack, go ahead.
Yeah, Bill, do you have any feeling how much the universities have saved through their furloughs? I don't know how many. I know U of L, the Health Science Center, a significant number of people have been furloughed because we have no patients or very few patients. I don't know what the furlough situation is with the other schools and how much they've saved.
We have not collected that information, and to answer your question, no, I don't have any indication of what those savings might be at this time.
Okay, just curious.
Any other questions?
Are there any questions before we entertain a motion? Can we entertain a motion?
Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion to approve.
Okay, thank you. Chair by a motion approved by Ms. Wright. Cheryl, was that you?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Second by Ms. Zimmerman.
Sure, everyone's unmuted. Sorry.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank
you. Are there any other questions or comments before we act on that motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of campus tuition mandatory fee proposals as submitted, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, motion carries. Thank you very much. Let's see. Do we need, I guess, Heather, what page are we on now in our onboards?
30 something, 38 maybe?
38, 39. Okay. All right. Okay. Next item is item 4. Delegating tuition approval authority to the Finance Committee. Sean, I understand you're going to handle this one.
I will. Happy to see everybody. I'm so sorry you can't see me. I'm wearing a tie. I'm looking fantastic. But for some reason, my video is not working, and that has never happened to me on Zoom before. And we've been trying to figure it out, but you'll just have to make do without seeing my face. So, but I promise I'm here. And Heather, if you can move on to the next slide. As you probably noticed, the University of Kentucky, University of Louisville, and Eastern Kentucky University did not have agenda items for tuition and fee proposals for you to consider. It's because their institutions have will be meeting. Their boards will be approving those rates after the council meeting on June 19th. And for the past 3 years, staff has required institutions to obtain approval from the governing boards before the council puts its approval on these items. And of course, more recently, we've asked institutions to seek approval from the Finance Committee before bringing proposals to the council. And as I mentioned, UK, U of L, and EKU have indicated that their boards will not be taking action until June 19th or after. And so we recommend that the council, that the committee, Finance Committee, ask the council for authority to approve tuition and fee proposals from these 3 institutions at a July meeting, preferably early July meeting.
And Sean, I want to clarify one comment that you made about the institutions not submitting tuition and fee proposals, and that's absolutely correct with respect to the University of Louisville and Eastern Kentucky University. But the University of Kentucky did submit their tuition and fee proposal, and in fact, we've gone ahead and drafted the agenda item, and it's an attachment in your packet behind the one-page agenda item with the title Delegation of Tuition and Fee Authority to the Finance Committee. And so this is what we anticipate will be the proposal that the University of Kentucky will be taking to their board. And their board is actually scheduled to meet on the same day as our council meeting, June 19th. But since that action is likely going to occur after the council would take action on the tuition and fee rates, and since we're asking the Finance Committee of the council to request of the full council the authority for the Finance Committee to approve tuition and fees for these 3 institutions in early July, then UK, U of L, and Eastern obviously would not have to wait until the next full council meeting, which is in September. But I did want to just point out that there is a tuition and fee proposal in your packet from the University of Kentucky. And at least in terms of what they have indicated to us that they plan to recommend to their board, it's a 1% increase in resident undergraduate tuition and fee rates, a 1% increase in graduate resident tuition and fee rates, and then a 2% increase in non-resident rates. So that is in your packets, and I thought I would bring that to your attention. And Sean, do you want to tell them what is also in their packet from the University of Louisville?
University of Louisville included a PowerPoint, some PowerPoint slides talking about their approach to next year's tuition and fees. And so we included that for your information. But they are considering several changes that would respond to some suggestions that they've received from members of the community and legislative leaders and so forth. I don't have the slides in front of me, but they are changing from having a different rate and applying it separately for online tuition and fees to having a flatter rate, and also they will be having a premium for a small premium for courses that are in excess of load. And so just minor changes to how they are charging tuition and fees in the coming year in response to concerns that the CPE has raised and other leaders and students and families. And so I would encourage you to look over those before the next Finance Committee meeting.
Yeah, and Sean, I do have the slides in front of me, and what you're talking about, their plan is to equalize online and in-person per credit hour charges. by residency. So if you're an in-state student, you would be paying the same charge per credit hour, whether you're an online student or you're an in-the-classroom student. And then if you're an out-of-state student, you would be paying the same charge, whether it's online or in person. And, you know, that's something that we had a discussion about 2 or 3 finance committee meetings ago. And U of L has been having discussions with faculty and with administrators and with students. And this is something that seems to be supported by a number of the stakeholders in that campus community. But at any rate, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we actually bring their formal tuition and fee proposal before the finance committee the next time the finance committee meets.
Bill?
Yes.
Could I ask, I'm looking at U of L's and they've got the change, but they don't have the percentage change. And we deal frequently with percentage change. Could you ask them to add that, please?
Yes, we will have that as part of our formal proposal. And I noticed that too. And I have a calculator right here on my phone.
Probably about 1% is what it's kind of looking like to me, maybe a little bit less for out of state, but
It's 2%.
is it 2%?
It's 1.99%. So yes, it's a 2% increase for resident undergraduate students.
Okay.
But we will have the actual percentages in addition to the dollar change when we bring their formal proposal before the finance committee.
But they also held 0 last year, correct? They did not.
I don't remember off the top of my head. Sean, do you remember?
I don't.
I'm pretty sure they were a 0.
Looky there.
Do you know, Bob?
I believe it was 0.
I thought it was 0 as well. Okay. But I'd just like the percentage to be included in there.
Yes, ma'am. Will do.
Thank you.
Bill or Sean, this is perhaps a strange question, but when you're an out-of-state student, you sign up for an online course at U of L, UK, what have you. Do you have to be enrolled within the university as a resident or non-resident, or can you just sign up for the course?
You can just sign up for the course, and if all you're taking is online courses, you don't even have to be within the state of Kentucky, and those are considered online-only students, and they're typically charged at a different per credit hour rate for those online courses, and of course, they are not charged any of the fees associated with being on campus.
Okay, so the comments that you were making about the online and in-person courses now having the same tuition for resident and non-resident, well, for resident and then another rate for non-resident, that seems to be a little bit in conflict with the open enrollment for non-resident students. Or am I making too much out of it?
And we'll have to get more details on U of L's proposal, but it may be that when they say they're going to equalize the in the classroom and the online per credit hour charge for resident undergraduate students, for example, that might actually be the students that are on campus. And that way there's not going to be that higher differential for taking an online course. If you're already on the campus, you'll just pay the same per credit hour course for an online course that you would for an face-to-face instruction in the classroom.
Okay.
But we'll certainly provide more details about that proposal when we bring their formal proposal before the finance committee.
Thank you.
And Dr. Stead, I won't put you on the spot today, but when this does come back, I guess I would be interested to hear your perspective on that topic, both from a University of Louisville perspective and a faculty perspective as well. So I know we've had some discussion on this topic.
I can do better on a faculty. I can do better on a faculty perspective because I don't get as much info on the tuition aspects as I used to at U of L. So
Okay.
I'm just more my own thoughts as opposed to representing U of L.
Okay, that'd be fine. But Bill, this will come back to us at our next meeting, I think. Is that correct?
Yes, with much more
Okay.
detail.
All right, great.
It'll-
Are there any other questions?
Excuse me, come back just to finance committee, right? If the board, if CPE board gives us, delegates the decision
Yes.
to us. Okay.
Yes. Are there any other questions for Sean or Bill on the topic at hand of delegating the tuition approval to the finance committee? Or is this an action item, Sean?
I believe it's just for discussion.
Okay. All right. So the action item will be asking the full council to delegate that to us. Then, all right. Okay.
Chair Branstetter, the one thing to keep in mind, though, is that we currently don't have a finance committee meeting scheduled for July. And so if the full council were to delegate authority to the finance committee to take action on behalf of these three institutions in terms of their tuition and fee proposals, this committee would have to select a date, hopefully sometime in early July, to have a special meeting just to come back and approve the tuition and fee proposals for these three institutions.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Yeah, we'll get Heather to work on that when we get, I think, when is Louisville's, when is their board meeting date? Do we know? I think they'll all be done by the end of June. So
Right.
We'll act on that, as soon as possible.
Yes. UK their board is meeting on June the 19th, the University of Louisville, June the 25th, and Eastern Kentucky University on June the 30th.
Okay, great. All right, just so all council or finance committee members just be aware of that, and I'm sure we'll be able to find some time on that. Item 5 is an update on. Are there other questions on that before we move to item 5?
Yeah, that's why I said early July.
All right.
It'll be after the action about the Eastern. Okay.
Lee, I believe you're next up on the agenda. Update on the CARES Act funding.
Good afternoon, everybody. Bill asked me to provide a brief update on the CARES Act and the funding flowing to higher education. So I'm going to talk today about 2 pots of funding through the CARES Act: the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund and the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund. Heather, next slide, please. So approximately $150 million is flowing to public and private campuses through the Relief Fund and the CARES Act, and $109 million is going to our public colleges and universities. You can see a breakdown of the distribution of those dollars in attachment A to this agenda item. Funding is going to campuses based on a formula that takes into account the % of students served overall and the % of Pell Grant students served. The Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund is broken out into 2 major funding pools: the emergency cash grants to students and emergency grants to institutions. And we've talked a little bit about this at your last meeting. 10% of the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund is reserved for HBCUs, other minority serving colleges and universities, and campuses serving high need students. Next slide, please. So in terms of emergency cash grants for students, that funding has been released by the U.S. Department of Education, and campuses are well into the disbursement process to students. Campuses must sign a letter of agreement and report the use of funds after the first 30 days and every 45 days thereafter. The funds must go directly to students to help them respond to emergency needs like food, shelter, childcare, and educational costs. Although campuses do have a great deal of discretion about how they structure the grant programs on their campuses. Next slide. So we asked for a report from each of the public universities several weeks ago to get a clearer sense about how the grant distribution was going and the criteria they were using to make awards. So based on those reports, awards seem to be averaging around $1,000 per student. Some campuses are just beginning the awarding process, while others are in the middle or towards the end. Most campuses have identified high-need students through a simple application process and or by analyzing financial aid data that's already on their campuses. Next slide. So the other major funding pool in the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund is going to campuses to help them respond to costs associated with the pandemic, like transitioning students to online programs, needed technology infrastructure, housing and dining reimbursements, and for other COVID costs. As with the student grant program, campuses have latitude in how they use these funds as long as they are within the broad criteria offered by the feds. Next slide. We asked for a status report on these funds as well, and I will say that campuses, at least in terms of mid-May, were just beginning to look at how those funds would be used on their campuses. Based on our survey, probably a significant portion of these dollars will be used by the campuses to cover reimbursements to students that they've already made for housing, dining, and parking expenses. They'll also use the funds for technology costs and for direct costs related to the pandemic, including testing, PPE costs, deep cleaning of campus facilities, and other issues and items around the pandemic. Next slide. And finally, as we reported at the last meeting, there is funding in the CARES Act that is going directly to the governors to use for their highest priority K-12 and post-secondary education needs. Kentucky has been approved to receive $44 million of the $3 billion in total going to the governors. Higher ed in Kentucky will receive $13.8 million, or about a third of those funds, and CPE will administer those funds. So I included an attachment to your agenda item that provides an overview of what we're calling the Kentucky Post-Secondary Education Recovery Grant Program, which was developed in consultation with the governor's office and the Education and Workforce Development Cabinet. We shared this overview with campuses last week, and we're in the process of developing contracts with each of the institutions to distribute those funds. In terms of program distribution, $1 million will go to Kentucky's nonprofit private colleges and universities on an equal share basis. So that works out to about $40,000 per campus. $2.5 million will go to KCTCS campuses through a distribution methodology, which is going to be developed by the KCTCS Central Office in consultation with CPE. Nearly $9 million will go to Kentucky's public universities, with each campus receiving a $440,000 base amount, and the remainder is going to be distributed based on the proportion of general funds that each school receives for instructions. So to get that, we're taking total general fund appropriations minus funding for debt service and mandated programs. And then finally, $1.5 million will stay at CPE in an emergency reserve fund, which campuses will be able to apply for throughout the year as unforeseen issues and challenges arise. So that was an area of interest for the governor and President Thompson to ensure that if emergencies arose at any point during the year, there was a small pot of fund that students could apply or schools could apply for. And Heather,
So
last slide,
that
please.
fund, sorry, I was just going to ask a quick question if that's possible. So talk about that emergency reserve fund. So that's a fund that will be housed at CPE. If
Yes.
someone chooses to apply for it, they can, and then we will make the decision whether or not, meaning staff at CPE will decide whether it's an emergency or not.
Well, Kim, we actually have not put any sort of criteria around this. At this point, it's a placeholder. And so those questions would come to the board to put additional sort of structure around this program. But you're right, there will be fundamental questions about what constitutes an emergency, how we would distribute those funds, at what priority level, that sort of thing.
And then in the event that, let's say, for example, that no one asks for this $1.5 million, is the expectation then that it would be dispersed out to the schools on a pro rata basis according to maybe what was done originally, or given back to the state, or what happens to the money?
Kim, let me jump in and answer a part of that. The governor, when we talked, when we got the money, he was anxious to keep some in reserve in case there was a need or something that he felt like we should focus on to help the campuses to do what they need to do, especially around the issues of online learning and some of those areas. So a part of the decision would be made by the governor with us about what those would look like. We have a year basically to distribute those funds in some fashion.
That's correct. And you know, it may be if the governor, you know, if there's money that is still on the table in the springtime, let's say, the governor may want to pull that back for use in the K-12 system. It may be that we want to do some state level collaborative work to move the state forward as a whole. I think all of that is really to be determined, and certainly want to bring these ideas before the board at the next meeting. Heather, last slide. So in terms of the criteria for the use of these grants through the post-secondary recovery grant program, the U.S. Department of Education placed a high emphasis on using these funds to improve access to quality remote learning opportunities, including providing wraparound services, advising and mentoring, particularly for students who might be transitioning into a post-secondary institution for the first time, or high-need students. There are also significant expenses related to readying campuses for in-person instruction in the fall. We know that students and families are facing increasing financial hardship and will likely need as much aid as they can get. And then campuses, as Bill mentioned and Aaron mentioned, are very likely to see general fund dollars continue to decline. So these grants, this grant program was purposely designed to be as flexible as possible to help campuses respond to what we know are going to be some very difficult financial challenges ahead. So that's a quick overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have, or pull in my colleagues to help answer them. If there's nothing else, Chair Branstetter.
Chair Branstetter, you're muted.
Heather got me again. Thank you, Lee, and appreciate the information and the update on this. I don't think that any of the other council members have any questions, so we'll move on to item 6, fiscal 2020-2021 performance fund distribution. And Bill, you are on.
All right, thank you, Chair Branstetter. As many of the Finance Committee members probably already know, the enacted budget, House Bill 352, appropriated $14,994,800 to the Post-Secondary Education Performance Fund. Those were not new dollars. Those funds represent the 2% stop-loss contributions from each of the universities and KCTCS. Just to refresh your memory, the 2% is applied to the adjusted net general fund, which is the total appropriation, or what's sometimes called the direct appropriation for each institution, minus debt service, minus any mandated public service or research programs. And what's left is essentially the funds that are available to educate students. So we take 2%, or the enacted budget took 2% of each institution's adjusted net general fund in the upcoming fiscal year, and that totaled close to $15 million. That was put into the Post-Secondary Education Performance Fund. Once that happens, the Council on Post-Secondary Education, and more particularly CPE staff, follows a process that is required in statute to allocate those funds between the university and the two-year college sector. And then we use a public university performance funding model to determine how the funds allocated to the university sector will be distributed. It's not included on this table, but there is a table included in the agenda item. It's on page 52 in the packet that I have. But it basically shows that the public universities in total had $572.3 million in 2021 adjusted net general fund. KCTCS institutions had $162.4 million. So the total for the system was $734.7 million in terms of the adjusted net general fund. And so by statute, the first thing that council staff has to do is do a percent of total for each sector. So the public universities were 77.9% of the total. KCTCS was 22.1%. And if you look at this table on the left-hand side, near the bottom of the table, you can see that KCTCS was allocated $3,315,200. That is their 22.1% share based on the total adjusted net general fund for the system. The public universities received that 77.9% share, which was $11,679,600. And so the distribution among the universities that you see above the KCTCS line, those numbers will total to that $11.7 million. In your packet, we included 6 tables that are very detailed that show how the performance funding model is run. And this is actually the 3rd year of full implementation of the performance funding model. There was a preliminary year that I like to call the model development year, where the governor and the General Assembly in 2017-18 had carved 5% out of each institution's base budget, with the exception of KSU. And that amount totaled $42.9 million that was put into the Post-Secondary Education Performance Fund. Those funds were distributed to the universities and to KCTCS, again excluding KSU in that first year. But then in statute, and it's KRS 164.092, from that point forward, it required a 3-year phase-in. And in the first year of full implementation, which was 2018-19, the General Assembly appropriated $31 million to the Post-Secondary Education Performance Fund. In the second year of implementation, which was 2019-20, they appropriated $38.7 million to the Post-Secondary Education Performance Fund. And the CPE finance staff in each of those years, we ran the model and notified the state budget director of the resulting distribution among institutions, among universities and KCTCS institutions in each of those years prior to the start of the fiscal year. And so that's what we're doing now. This is the 3rd iteration, and the $14.9 million has been appropriated for the upcoming fiscal year. And on May 28th, just a few weeks ago, we notified State Budget Director John Hicks of the distribution that you see on this page using the statutory funding model for the universities, and then also a statutorily defined performance funding model for KCTCS. And so that's how the dollars were distributed. Heather, if you'll go on to the next page. And I would be happy if any of the Finance Committee members want us to go through those detailed tables. I would be glad to do so. There's 6 tables that start with that original allocation between the university sector and the KCTCS sector. That's table 1. Table 2 is determining what are the allocable resources in the university sector model that you can actually run through the funding model. And then tables 3 through 6 are the actual detailed tables where we allow the student success outcomes and the operational support activity to determine how that $14.9 million will be distributed. But you know, all of that is very detailed, so I thought I would just skip to this summary table. This table is showing for the public universities only, this doesn't include KCTCS, for the 11 metrics that we utilize in the performance funding model, in which metrics were rates of growth above the sector average by institution. And as you can see, if it's above the average, we've got a check mark and we've got it highlighted in green. So at the University of Kentucky, on 10 out of 11 metrics, their increase in bachelor's degrees, their increase in underrepresented minority degrees, et cetera, exceeded the sector average. And it was only in student progression at 60 credit hours were they below the sector average. At the University of Louisville, it was 7 out of 11 total metrics where they exceeded the sector average. Northern and Western fared the best among the comprehensive universities. Northern was 5 out of 11 metrics where their growth exceeded the sector average, and WKU 4 out of 11 metrics. And Heather, if you back up to the previous slide for just a moment, you can see in the distribution of the dollars that the institutions that received the lion's share of the funding were those that did well in beating the sector average. And that includes the University of Kentucky, the University of Louisville, Northern Kentucky University, and Western Kentucky University certainly excelled in terms of their productivity a little better than some of the other comprehensive institutions. All right, Heather, go on to the next slide.
Bill, can I ask a question, please?
Sure.
So I was just curious, and you may not know the answer, and that's okay. But you know, part of my understanding of why performance funding was put into place was what was believed to be, you know, a disparity in how funding was allocated at the state level. Right. If we went back to what things look like prior to performance funding to now, do we see that it's making the impact that was desired? I mean, is there a way to analyze that? And I don't expect that you would know that off the top of your head, but is there a way to analyze, are we truly achieving what was intended at the time that this was put in place?
Well,
and I say that from a dollar perspective, not from a metric perspective.
And the answer to that is yes, it is accomplishing what it was intended to accomplish, because it is moving the institutions, particularly in the university sector, toward equilibrium. The same is happening, I've heard from our campus administrators at KCTCS. Those institutions are moving toward funding parity within the KCTCS pool of funding. And so, yes, it is operating as intended. Have we achieved full funding parity? The answer to that is no, because we still have a couple of institutions in Kentucky State University and in Morehead State University that still have what's called a hold harmless allocation. And, you know, we really never anticipated that we would get all of the institutions to the same funding level as Kentucky State University, because that would take 150 to 200 million new dollars. And to this point, and I think I should clarify this, what has been going on with the performance funding in terms of that $42.9 million that was appropriated in that model development year, the $31 million that was appropriated in 18-19, the $38.7 million that was appropriated in 19-20, and even this $14.9 million that's being distributed here, none of those dollars were new dollars to post-secondary education. All of those funds represent funding that's been carved out of the base budgets of the institutions. And that's part of the reason why some of our institutions are not enamored with this performance funding model, is because especially in years where they're also getting other budget cuts. For some of our institutions, this essentially acts like a second round of budget cuts because you take 2% in terms of their stop loss contribution, and then they don't get any funding back in terms of what they contributed. And so you're getting a cut from the state in terms of your direct appropriation, and then you're getting an additional cut through the performance funding model because it has not been funded over this 4-year time period. And so that's something that is going to be addressed by the working group that's going to be reconvening here in about 3 weeks. It can reconvene as early as July 1. But me and my staff and David Mahan and the staff of the Information and Advanced Analytics unit here at the council, over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be putting together a very comprehensive analysis of what has been happening financially. What has each institution contributed in terms of either budget cuts or stop loss contributions? What have they gotten back in terms of the distributions from the performance funding model? In terms of trends and the outcomes data, we're going to be doing a very comprehensive analysis because we want to provide that working group with as much information as possible to begin those discussions because our time frame is going to be somewhat limited. The General Assembly is going to be coming back into session in January. Is that correct, Ron? And so we're essentially going to have about 6 months to work with that working group. And just to refresh the memory of the Finance Committee, it was the governor or his representative, and this is the composition of the working group, the governor or his representative, president of the Senate or his or her representative, Speaker of the House, his or her representative, the president from every university, the KCTCS president, and President Aaron Thompson will represent the Council on Post-Secondary Education on that working group. And so that group will be reconvening in July. And as I say, we're going to do a comprehensive analysis over the next 3 weeks to prepare for bringing that group back together. And we certainly want to share that with members of the Finance Committee as soon as we have that analysis completed. And we're going to keep you apprised of any discussions that are taking place in that working group. But we hope to be able to come back in January with recommendations for the General Assembly and the governor in terms of any potential modifications of the performance funding model, whether that be changes in the weightings or adding or dropping certain metrics, what to do about the hold harmless allocations that act as a fiscal cliff for Kentucky State University and Morehead State University. But more importantly, in my mind, what do you do with a performance funding model that was put into place with the promise on the part of the governor at the time that, yeah, we're going to provide new funding as we implement this performance funding model. And then we've gone 4 years in a row with no new funding, and we're just carving money out of the base and redistributing it. That sets up a competitive atmosphere
Right.
in our institutions.
And I think that, thank you for clarifying that, because that's what I was trying a little bit to understand is that, had we not implemented this, what would things look like for these universities on and go forward? And clearly some have been harmed based on not achieving the metrics, which, this is a circle conversation to a certain extent, but I was trying to understand. I mean, this is sort of have we set up a model that's more aligned to the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, or is it truly achieving the outcomes that we're looking for? That's where I was at. So thank you for that. I didn't mean to go off on that. So.
And what I can tell you, the funding model has without a doubt caused institutions to change institutional behavior. Because of the financial incentives that are built into the funding model, we've had several of our institutions that have aligned their internal budget processes to reward departments and colleges within a given university along the lines of the same metrics that we're using at the state level. Institutions have incorporated the performance funding model metrics as part of their strategic planning processes. And quite frankly, it's having a pretty significant effect in some areas, in STEM plus H degree production and underrepresented minority degree production are two that come to mind. And we're going to see a couple of slides in just a minute. And the growth in the number of degrees among STEM plus H bachelor's degrees and underrepresented minority degrees has been substantial. And we believe that is directly as a result of the performance funding model. And so, you know, there are a lot of positives to providing those kinds of financial incentives. I would say the biggest negative to this point associated with the performance funding model is that the General Assembly has not been able to provide any new funding to fund that growth. We've seen growth at some of our institutions, and unfortunately what's happening, that growth is being funded from the base budgets of other institutions instead of being funded with new appropriations. Go ahead.
Got it. Thank you.
Next slide, Heather. And the main thing I wanted to point out by going back to the previous slide was that if you look at the institutions on this page that are beating the sector average on the most number of metrics, that's what determines how the funding is going to be distributed. And institutions like UK and U of L, and to a lesser extent, but also Northern and Western, received a larger share of that $11 to $12 million that was allocated among the universities. Go to the next slide, Heather. And this is what I'm talking about. This is the growth in STEM plus H degrees since 2013-14, and that's the first year of data that we have that was used in the first 3-year rolling average of the performance funding model. So that 2013-14 year is our base year. But we have had essentially, as a group of universities, about 5%, a little over 5% growth per year in STEM plus H bachelor's degrees produced. And of course, you can see the sector average in the bar chart to the left at 31% growth on average over that time period. UK at 52% growth, Morehead, Eastern, and U of L between 32 and 35% growth. KSU was the only institution that showed negative growth in the production of STEM plus H degrees over that time period. And if you look at the red arrow and the message at the bottom of the page on the left, you know, what drives the funding and how it's distributed in this funding model are, you know, institutions that on a given metric have growth rates that exceed that sector average. And so, you know, that is the key for trying to garner additional resources through this performance funding model. Over to the right, taking a look at the pie chart, this is the cumulative net gain in STEM plus H bachelor's degrees over that 5-year period. And if you look sort of in the center toward the lower half of the page, you can see that the total additional STEM plus H degrees that have been produced over this 5-year period is 5,270. UK produced 2,066 of that total, EKU's 779 additional degrees of that total, Murray 723, and so on. But among 4 institutions, again above the red arrow, you see the message that UK, Eastern, Murray, and U of L produced 80% of the net gain in STEM plus H degrees over this time period. Okay, go ahead to the next slide, Heather. And this is a really good story right here. I think all of us are aware that the council's strategic agenda and among President Thompson's 5 priorities is that we need to close achievement gaps. And what this bar chart on the left is showing is that the sector average growth in underrepresented minority bachelor's degrees produced has been close to 6% per year over the past 5 years. Morehead has had a 98% increase in URN bachelor's degrees produced. Of course, they're coming off a lower base. UK, an 80% increase in underrepresented minority degree production. That's just unprecedented. Northern and Western, 40%, 34%. All of those institutions were above the sector average in terms of their degree production among minority students. And I will tell you that the incentives built into the performance funding model provide nearly 8 times as many dollars for each additional bachelor's degree granted to an underrepresented minority student than a bachelor's degree awarded to any type of student, just a bachelor's degree among all students. And so there's a very large incentive within this funding model, and it's changing behaviors. Institutions are recruiting and progressing and graduating minority students at a rate that we have not seen, since I've been at the council. So this is one of the success stories, if you will, of the performance funding model. And as I say, it would really be a good story if only the General Assembly had provided some new funding over the past 3 or 4 years to help support the model. As you can see in terms of the pie chart, a total of 1,988 additional URM bachelor's degrees produced. In 3 universities, UK, U of L, and Northern produced 76% of that cumulative net gain over that time period. Is that it, Heather? I think that might be the last slide on, yes. So I would be more than happy if members of this finance committee want to set up a time with me and Sean McKiernan and Ryan Kaffenberger. We would be happy to walk you through some of those more detailed tables. And as I say, in the next 4 weeks to 6 weeks, we're hopeful to have a very detailed and thorough assessment of not only what has happened in terms of the financial impact of the performance funding model, but what's going on for each of these metrics. What have been the trends at each institutions, what's working and what's not. We want to be able to provide that report to the working group sometime in July.
Bill, can you remind me, back when we were developing this model, the discussion was what percentage of the funding would be affected by the model? I remember Tennessee was only 2%. At one point, it was suggested that 100% of the funding would be affected by the model. Is that still in vogue?
Well, what this model does, Dr. Stat, is it runs 100% of what we call the allocable resources through the funding model. Heather, is there any way that you can pull up like table 1 and then table 2 that are in the packet so that people can see it on their screen?
Yes, just give me 1 second, please. You can probably go ahead and talk.
What's that, Heather?
Do you know what page it's on?
Let's see. It would be the last page number is 53 in terms of the agenda item, so I would assume it would be 54.
No, that is, you said table 1 inside the agenda item?
It's the attachment to the agenda item, yeah.
Oh, okay. Table 1, I see it now. Apologize.
And what I'm going to show you, Dr. Stat, is the allocable resources that are run through the performance funding model. Table 1 is essentially calculating the adjusted net general fund by sector. And so in column A, you start with each institution's enacted 2021 general fund. That's their total general fund, sometimes referred to as their direct appropriation. But that has debt service, that has mandated program funding embedded in it. So in column B, we're backing out debt service from Eastern Kentucky University. In column C, we're backing out funding for mandated research and public service programs. And so in column D, Dr. Stadt highlighted in mauve, I guess, that's the adjusted net general fund for each university, total of $572.3 million. And then for KCTCS, you can see backing out their mandated program funding, that $8.8 million, their adjusted net general fund is $162.4 million. So to the right of that, of column D, you can see that percent of total. And so it's defined in statute how any available funding in the performance pool is to be distributed. Heather, I can't, is there a way that I can minimize this video? I can't see the columns over to the right. Or can you just shift it over a little bit?
Which columns? Oh, no, I really can't.
Okay, well, I've got it in front of me, so I can.
Or maybe I can do it this way. This might be weird. Are you talking about this
there you
percent
go.
of total? Okay.
Yeah, so once you do the percent of total, you apply those percentages to the available funding, which is $14,994,800, and there's your sector allocation. So highlighted in green, $11,679,600 is the university allocation. Okay. Now, Heather, if you'll go to table 2. Yes, perfect. Dr. Stadt, we take that adjusted net general fund, and again, this is defined in statute. We back out what's called a small school adjustment for each institution. It totals $56.1 million. But what you see in yellow, that's what runs through the performance funding model. It's $516.2 million initially. And so it's not totally 100% of the funding because you're not running the debt service through the funding model. You're not running the mandated program funding through the funding model. You're not running the small school adjustment through the funding model, but you are running about $516.2 million through the funding model. And Heather, go to table 3. And what this is doing, again, you've got the same numbers that you've just seen in columns A, B, and C, and there's the $516 million that you're running through the performance funding model. And you're distributing those funds based on student success outcomes in those first couple of columns under outcomes-based components. So you're distributing $180.7 million based on the number of degrees produced, the number of STEM degrees produced, the number of URM and low-income degrees produced, the number of students progressed. Then in the next 2 columns, the course completion dollars, another $180.7 million is distributed based on earned credit hour share. And so you can see those percentages. UK, for example, has a 31.3% share of the earned credit hours. They had a 33.4% share of the student success component pool. And then continue to scroll to the right if you would, Heather. And then, of course, you've got 3 pools that are considered operational support activity metrics, and that would be square footage for distributing the maintenance and operations funding. That's $51.6 million. The institutional support funding, which is another $51.6 million, is distributed based on each institution's share of total instruction and student services cost. Which is more or less a measure of the size of your academic enterprise. And then lastly, the academic support, which is for your library and academic computing expenditures, another $51.6 million is distributed based on FTE student share. And scroll just a little farther, Heather, if you will. And if highlighted in blue are the formula totals. And if you were to distribute the funds exactly how the model says those dollars should be distributed, this is how they would be distributed in column D. But we're not, even though we're running all of the dollars through the funding model, what we end up doing is using the model to inform how we distribute that $14.9 million. Heather, can you skip to table 6. So what we do once we run through the model is we do table 6, which is the subsequent distribution of allocable resources. And the reason that we call this the subsequent distribution is because we start with the same adjusted net general fund in column A, but then we, in highlighted in green in column B, we plug in how the 11.7 million, this is what the model is telling us the distribution should be for the university sector, the 11.7 million. And so that's what's actually being distributed. So even though we run all of the dollars through the funding model, we're only using the model to inform how we distribute 11.7 million. Again, what we do is we add those two together in column C to get a revised general fund. We back out the small school adjustment. In column E in purple, that's the hold harmless allocation. And that's the fiscal cliff that we keep talking about 6.9 million for KSU, 2.8 million for Moorhead, 675,000 for Murray State. Okay, Heather, scroll on to the right. So that allows you to calculate a new allocable resource number in column F, keep in the student success, credit hour share, square feet share. All of those are the same as in table 3. Keep going to the right, Heather. A little further to the right. Keep going, keep going, keep going. One more.
I can't go any further.
A little further to the right, Heather. Can you?
Well,
Are you after G and H?
Yeah, I'm trying to get to columns G and H.
We got it.
Okay, if you can see it, what this is showing is that there's essentially no difference between column F and column G in the difference column. And the reason we run the model one last time after we calculated the distribution numbers and the hold harmless numbers, it shows us that you, quote, achieved equilibrium in the funding model given what you had available to distribute and given that there's still some hold harmless allocations out there. And so this is a lengthy answer, I know, but yes, we run essentially all of the allocable resources through the funding model, but we use that to inform how we're going to distribute, in this case for the university sector, about $11.6, $11.7 million.
Okay. And that I appreciate. Did the legislature go along with the 2% stop loss?
Yes, I mean it's in the enacted budget. They
Okay.
used our numbers to calculate the stop loss for 2021, and those are their numbers, and that's where that $14.99 million amount came from. They reduced the base budgets of every institution and then put the 14.9 million in the performance fund.
Okay.
And that's what they've done in prior years, and that's why I say that, you know, this is essentially the 4th year where we're distributing money that don't represent new appropriations.
In the performance funding law too, for the upcoming year, there is a 2% stop loss. So they went with the law. It was the following year that they would have to come down and say what the stop loss amount would be. So
Okay.
That's a good point, Sean. In the performance funding statute, it actually says in year 2021-22, there will no longer be any hold harmless allocations and no more stop loss. Well, when they say no more stop loss, it's essentially a 100% stop loss, which means you would run all of the money through the performance funding model, and whatever the result would be in table 3, that's how the money would be distributed. And so an institution like KSU could immediately lose as much as $6.8 million out of their base. Moorhead could lose $2.8 million out of their base. And that's why President Thompson and myself and Sean and the rest of the CPE staff, we keep talking about that fiscal cliff. And it was not the intention of staff or the working group to say, you know, once we get beyond 3 years, institutions should fall off that fiscal cliff if they still have hold harmless allocations. We just said, let's run the model for 3 years, get back together as a working group and assess what works and what doesn't, and then we'll come back with recommendations. But somehow in statute, it ended up saying, you know, there will no longer be any stop loss or hold harmless allocations once you get to year 2021, 22. And actually we're a little bit, if there's a silver lining to having a 1-year budget, it's that, you know, a decision can be made by the working group and recommendations can be made in January to the General Assembly. So when they construct that budget for 2021, 22, they can include language that does allow a stop loss to continue or make any other kind of modifications to the performance funding statute if they choose to do so. So we'll have the opportunity to do that before they enact a budget for 2021, 22.
Very good. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? And like I say,
I think so, Bill.
You know, Sean and Brian and I would be more than happy to schedule a couple of hours, you know, to do a education and training session on all of the details of the performance funding model if any council members are interested.
Thank you, Bill. That is a very deep topic. I appreciate it. Very deep topic. And I am excited about the fact that we are going to get the performance funding working group going in July, and I'm hopeful in what they're going to come up with and some of the recommendations that they see. So that'll be good stuff there. Next item is item 7, update on the proposed 2020-2021 agenda, or I'm sorry, agency operating budget. There is information in your packet on this. I'll just note here, there's no action item for Finance Committee today, but just let everybody know that last week the Executive Committee did review and approve the proposed agency operating budget, and it will go to the full council at next week's meeting. If you have any questions, go ahead and call Bill or Sean before next week, if you don't mind. Some of the people that are on finance are also on executive, so I don't want to spend any more time today talking about that. We've already lost a couple of people here so far. Just remind everybody of the full council meeting on June 19th, and we will be taking up the recommendations and agenda items or action items that we worked on today. And as we said before, Heather's going to work on a date for a special Finance Committee meeting, assuming all goes according to plan. Just before we adjourn, I do want to maybe I'll have Heather send this out to everybody, but Moody's Investor Service. And for those who've been around with us for a while, we had Moody's representatives. Moody's, the rating agency, came in. I guess it's about 2 years ago now, when we had a meeting in Frankfurt, and gave a presentation to our working group prior to the full council meeting. They've got a new higher ed and community college report out, dated June 3rd. It's actually kind of interesting. There's 3 kind of highlights, and I'll just bring these up for people to think about as we're moving over the course of the next few months. But yeah, their first comment is that high unemployment signals the potential for overall enrollment gains, which I thought is very interesting, because we've been talking about enrollment losses potentially in the near term, but in the longer run, they're actually talking about the potential for overall enrollment gains. However, the next kind of their bolded bullet point says that even if enrollment grows, net tuition and other student revenue will fall. So it's the line somehow are crossing there. So it'll be interesting to dig into that. And then lastly, they say market share shifts are likely to favor lower priced alternatives. So give that some thought. I think that's relevant, especially as we've been looking at tuition prices today. And it obviously goes into a lot more detail. So I'll send this over to Heather and Lee and get this out to all the council members. And I think that'll be, it's about a 10, 15 page report. And we have been talking at our executive committee, I believe, about having Moody's come back and then doing a refresh at hopefully at our September meeting. I think that presentation go off a lot better in an in-person environment rather than the video environment that we've been doing the last few months. So I appreciate everybody's indulgence and their effort and time today. Unless there's anything else to discuss, can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All right, so moved in a second. All those in favor, hit the leave button.